What happens when a powerful judge crosses the line in court? In this gripping courtroom drama, seasoned attorney Pam Bondi faces off against Judge Edward Walter, a man notorious for his arrogance and sharp tongue. The air in the Orlando courtroom was thick with tension. The low hum of ceiling fans mixed with the scratching of pens on notepads as reporters filled the gallery, their eyes darting between the bench and the fiery attorney at the podium. The 12 jurors sat in 2 neat rows, their faces a mix of curiosity and unease. Whispers rippled softly through the room like distant thunder, and even the bailiff seemed to sense the storm brewing. Judge Edward Walter loomed behind the bench, his sharp features set in a mask of smug authority. His reputation preceded him, a man known for wielding his gavel with an iron fist and his words like a dagger. He had spent decades building a reputation as both brilliant and merciless, though the latter often left attorneys trembling at the mere mention of his name. Pam Bondi, however, was not easily rattled. Standing tall in her tailored navy blue suit, she exuded a quiet but formidable confidence. Her blonde hair was pinned neatly back, and her piercing gaze held steady as she addressed the jury. Her voice, measured and deliberate, carried the conviction of a woman who had spent her career fighting for justice. "This case," she began, her voice cutting through the murmurs like a blade, "is not just about fraud. It's about betrayal. My clients, the Ramirez family, trusted the defendants to help them purchase their first home. Instead, they were preyed upon, deceived, and left with nothing." Pam's words resonated, and for a moment, the room held its collective breath. But the moment was shattered by the sharp crack of Judge Walter's gavel. "Ms. Bondi," he interrupted, his tone dripping with condescension, "you are dangerously close to turning this courtroom into a theater. Perhaps you should save the dramatics for your closing arguments, if we make it that far." The gallery stirred, reporters scribbling furiously. Pam's jaw tightened, but she refused to break her composure. Her hands rested lightly on the podium as she met the judge's gaze without flinching. "With all due respect, Your Honor," she said evenly, "I am simply laying the foundation for the facts of this case." Walter leaned forward, his dark eyes narrowing. "Facts, Ms. Bondi, require evidence, not melodrama. And if you can't distinguish between the two, perhaps you're in the wrong profession." A ripple of murmurs spread through the room, punctuated by the audible click of cameras. Pam's cheeks flushed slightly, but her expression remained calm, her eyes burning with quiet resolve. She had faced men like Walter before, men who wielded their power like a weapon, who underestimated her because of her gender or her unwavering determination. Pam turned back to the jury, her voice unwavering. "The evidence will show," she continued, her tone steady, "that the defendants knowingly falsified documents and misled my clients. They exploited the hopes and dreams of a hardworking family for their own gain." Walter's gavel struck again, the sound cutting through the room like a thunderclap. "Ms. Bondi, this is your final warning. If you continue this performance, I will hold you in contempt." The gallery gasped, the tension in the room rising to a fever pitch. Reporters exchanged knowing glances, sensing a headline in the making. "Judge Walter clashes with Pam Bondi in explosive fraud trial." Pam inhaled slowly, her hands tightening on the podium. She looked at the judge, her eyes steely and unwavering. "Understood, Your Honor," she said calmly, though her tone carried an edge that was impossible to miss. Walter leaned back in his chair, a self-satisfied smirk playing at his lips. He had seen countless attorneys crumble under his scrutiny, and he clearly expected Pam to do the same. But as she returned her attention to the jury, it was clear that she had no intention of backing down. Inside, Pam's mind raced. She had prepared for this, anticipated Walter's tactics. His insults, his interruptions, they were a desperate attempt to rattle her, to undermine her credibility in front of the jury. But she wouldn't give him the satisfaction. Not today. Not when so much was at stake. As she continued laying out her case, her voice steady and composed, she kept her ace carefully hidden. She knew the judge's arrogance would be his downfall. She had spent months gathering evidence, building a case not just against the developers but against Walter himself. Secret audio recordings, bank statements, testimony from a whistleblower. All of it meticulously documented and ready to present. She stole a glance at the judge, her lips curling into the faintest of smiles. Let him underestimate her. Let him believe he held all the power in this room. Because when the time came, she would turn the tables, and the mighty Edward Walter would fall. The tension in the courtroom lingered like an uninvited guest as Pam Bondi resumed her presentation. Her voice remained composed, though she could feel the eyes of the jurors darting between her and Judge Edward Walter, who sat with a smug expression etched into his sharp features. His gavel rested ominously beside his hand, as if daring her to step out of line again. Pam advanced confidently, directing the jury's attention to an oversized board displaying key documents in the case. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, her voice steady, "the Ramirez family placed their trust in the defendants, believing their dream of homeownership was finally within reach. These documents, however, paint a very different picture, one of deceit, manipulation, and fraud." She pointed to a highlighted section of a forged property deed, her explanation clear and concise. The jurors leaned forward, absorbing her words. Even the gallery quieted, sensing the gravity of her argument. But Judge Walter was having none of it. He leaned forward abruptly, interrupting her with a sharp tone. "Ms. Bondi, this isn't a lecture hall. Do try to keep your explanations brief and relevant." Pam's fingers tightened slightly on the pointer, but she didn't flinch. "Of course, Your Honor," she replied, maintaining her composure. "I'll proceed with the next piece of evidence." Walter leaned back in his chair with a self-satisfied smirk, clearly enjoying his role as the self-proclaimed gatekeeper of courtroom decorum. The reporters in the gallery scribbled furiously, their headlines practically writing themselves. Pam Bondi silenced again by Judge Walter. Courtroom drama escalates. Pam pressed on, undeterred. She gestured toward a series of emails projected onto a screen, correspondence between the defendants that revealed their intent to deceive the Ramirez family. "These emails," she explained, "clearly demonstrate that the defendants conspired to falsify information about the property's value and legal status." But before she could continue, Walter interrupted once more, his gavel striking the bench loudly. "Ms. Bondi, I don't need a play-by-play of every word in those emails. The jury can read." Pam turned to face him, her calm mask firmly in place, though her eyes burned with unspoken defiance. "Your Honor, I believe it's important to ensure the jury fully understands the context of this evidence." Walter's smile twisted into something sharper, more cutting. "And I believe it's important to ensure this trial doesn't devolve into a spectacle. Do not make me repeat myself." The gallery stirred again, the tension mounting as Pam met Walter's gaze. She could feel his eyes boring into her, daring her to push back. But she remained composed, her voice level as she addressed the jury once more. "As I was saying," she continued, "the evidence clearly shows a pattern of deliberate deception. The Ramirez family's trust was betrayed, and they were left with nothing but broken promises and financial ruin." Walter let out a loud sigh, the sound deliberately theatrical. "Ms. Bondi, you have 30 seconds to wrap this up before I move on to the defense. If you can't manage that, I will hold you in contempt." A ripple of shock swept through the gallery, the jurors exchanging uneasy glances. Pam inhaled slowly, refusing to let his threats shake her resolve. She glanced at the clock, then returned her attention to the jury. "Thank you, Your Honor," she said coolly, her tone carrying the faintest edge of sarcasm. "I'll make my next point brief." She pulled up a final slide, this one showing bank records that hinted at financial discrepancies between the defendants and a shell corporation tied to the fraudulent transactions. "This," she said, pointing to a particular transfer, "is just one example of how the defendants funneled money from the Ramirez family into accounts that were never disclosed." Pam's words hung in the air, and for a brief moment, the room was silent, until Walter's gavel came down once again. "That's enough, Ms. Bondi," he said sharply. "We've heard quite enough of your examples. The defense may now proceed." Pam stepped back from the podium, her movements measured and deliberate. She could feel the weight of Walter's gaze on her as she returned to her seat, but she refused to look at him. Instead, she focused on the jurors, noting the glimmers of doubt and curiosity in their eyes. Despite Walter's constant interruptions, her message was getting through. As the defense began their arguments, Pam sat quietly, her mind racing. Walter's bias was glaringly obvious, and she suspected the jury had noticed as well. But she couldn't let his behavior derail her. She had evidence that would not only expose the defendant's crimes but also reveal the judge's complicity, a strategy she had been carefully planning for months. Pam stole a glance at Walter, who was leaning back in his chair with an air of smug satisfaction. She knew he believed he was untouchable, that his power in the courtroom was absolute. But he didn't know what she knew. He didn't know about the audio recordings, the bank statements, or the whistleblower who was prepared to testify. And he certainly didn't know that Pam had already coordinated with federal authorities, ensuring that justice would be served, both for the Ramirez family and for everyone who had ever been wronged by Walter's corruption. She allowed herself a small, fleeting smile, one that went unnoticed by everyone but herself. Let Walter play his games, she thought. Let him underestimate her. Because when the time came, she would reveal her hand, and the mighty Edward Walter would have no choice but to face the consequences of his actions. The defense attorney's closing statement had barely concluded when Pam Bondi rose from her seat. The atmosphere in the Orlando courtroom had shifted. There was an unspoken tension, a sense that something larger was brewing beneath the surface. Judge Edward Walter, still perched on the bench with his usual air of superiority, gestured for her to proceed, clearly expecting more of the same arguments he had dismissed with disdain all morning. But Pam had no intention of continuing as before. The time had come to play her hand. "Your Honor," Pam began, her voice calm yet commanding. "Before I continue, I would like to call an additional witness to the stand." Walter's smirk faltered slightly. "Additional witness? Ms. Bondi, this request should have been made during pretrial motions." Pam nodded, undeterred. "That's correct, Your Honor, but new information has come to light that directly pertains to the integrity of these proceedings." Walter's eyes narrowed. "And who, pray tell, is this mystery witness?" Pam turned toward the back of the courtroom, where a man in his early 40s sat quietly. He wore a crisp button-down shirt, his hair neatly combed, but his expression carried the weight of someone stepping into the spotlight reluctantly. "I'd like to call Mr. Timothy Harris to the stand." The name meant nothing to most of the people in the room, but not to Judge Walter. His hand froze mid-reach for his gavel, and for a fleeting moment, his usual air of confidence slipped. "Who is this individual, Ms. Bondi?" Walter asked, his tone sharper now, more defensive. Pam glanced at him, her expression unreadable. "Mr. Harris is a former judicial assistant who worked in this very courtroom, Your Honor. He has testimony that is directly relevant to this case." Walter's face tightened, and for the first time, the reporters in the gallery noticed a hint of unease in his posture. The whispers grew louder, pens scratching furiously across notepads as they sensed the brewing storm. The bailiff escorted Timothy Harris to the stand, where he took the oath with a steady voice. Pam approached him, her calm demeanor masking the fire in her eyes. "Mr. Harris," she began, "can you please state your former position for the record?" "I was Judge Walter's judicial assistant for 5 years," Harris replied, his voice steady but tinged with nerves. Walter cleared his throat loudly, the sound cutting through the room. "Ms. Bondi, I must warn you, this line of questioning better be directly relevant to the case at hand." Pam didn't flinch. "I assure you, Your Honor, it is." She turned back to Harris, her tone softening slightly. "Mr. Harris, during your time working in this courtroom, were you ever privy to discussions or actions that you believed were inappropriate or unethical?" Walter's gavel struck the bench hard. "Objection. This is irrelevant and speculative." Pam turned to the judge, her gaze unwavering. "If Your Honor would allow Mr. Harris to answer, I believe his testimony will establish the relevance." Walter hesitated, his grip on the gavel tightening. The room held its collective breath as he debated his next move. Finally, with a dismissive wave, he said, "Proceed." Pam nodded, turning back to Harris. "You may answer the question." Harris glanced nervously at Walter before speaking. "Yes, I did witness actions that I believed were inappropriate." The gallery erupted in murmurs, the tension in the room ratcheting up several notches. Walter's face darkened, and he leaned forward, his voice a low growl. "Mr. Harris, I suggest you choose your words carefully." Pam stepped forward, placing herself between Harris and the bench. "Mr. Harris, can you describe these actions in detail?" Harris hesitated, clearly torn, but then his shoulders straightened as he resolved to continue. "I overheard conversations between Judge Walter and several individuals associated with local developers. Conversations that suggested financial transactions in exchange for favorable rulings." The courtroom exploded into chaos. Reporters scrambled to capture the moment, and the jurors exchanged shocked glances. Walter's gavel pounded furiously, his voice rising above the commotion. "Enough! This is outrageous. I will not have my courtroom turned into a circus." Pam remained calm, her gaze steady as she addressed the judge. "Your Honor, the integrity of these proceedings is at stake. The jury has the right to know if the presiding judge holds a conflict of interest." Walter's face was flushed with anger now, his composure unraveling before everyone's eyes. "You are out of line, Ms. Bondi. I will hold you in contempt if you continue this baseless attack." But Pam was unfazed. She reached into her briefcase, pulling out a stack of documents. "Your Honor, I have further evidence to corroborate Mr. Harris's testimony. Evidence that cannot be ignored." Walter's eyes darted to the papers in her hand, and for the first time, genuine fear flickered across his face. Pam placed the documents on the evidence table, her voice steady and clear. "These," she said, "are bank statements showing payments from the developers in question to offshore accounts tied directly to Judge Walter." The courtroom erupted once more, the weight of her words crashing down like a tidal wave. Walter slammed his gavel down repeatedly, his shouts drowned out by the chaos. And Pam stood resolute, ready to reveal the final pieces of her case. Pam Bondi stood tall at the podium, her calm yet commanding voice slicing through the chaos that engulfed the courtroom. Judge Edward Walter's repeated pounding of his gavel echoed like thunder, but it did nothing to quell the murmur of shock from the gallery or the wide-eyed expressions on the faces of the jury. The tide had begun to shift, and Pam was steering it with precision. "Your Honor," she began firmly, speaking over the judge's increasingly desperate attempts to regain control. "The integrity of this courtroom demands transparency. The evidence I have presented is critical, not just for this case but for ensuring justice is upheld." Walter's face was a shade of crimson, his composure unraveling with every word. "Ms. Bondi," he barked, his voice trembling with barely contained fury, "this is a blatant attack on my character. I will not allow this circus to continue." Pam turned to the jury, deliberately ignoring Walter's outburst. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, you have just heard testimony from Mr. Harris, who worked closely with Judge Walter. You have seen the financial records connecting him to the very defendants in this case. And now, I will present the final piece of evidence that ties it all together." The room fell silent, the weight of anticipation pressing down on everyone present. Pam reached into her briefcase and retrieved a small device, a voice recorder. "This," she said, holding it aloft, "contains an audio recording of a private conversation between Judge Walter and the defendants, discussing financial arrangements that directly compromised the fairness of this trial." Walter surged to his feet, his gavel raised as if to strike another blow. "Objection," he roared. "This recording is inadmissible. It's a violation of—" "It's perfectly admissible under the federal whistleblower protections," Pam interrupted, her tone razor-sharp. "The recording was obtained legally and is directly relevant to this case. If Your Honor disputes its validity, we can let the federal authorities weigh in." The room erupted once more, but this time, the noise was punctuated by the click of a button as Pam played the recording. The sound of Judge Walter's voice filled the courtroom, unmistakable and damning. "So we're agreed," the recording began. "You take care of my offshore account, and I'll ensure this case goes your way. Nobody needs to know." The jurors leaned forward, their faces a mix of disbelief and outrage. The reporters scribbled furiously, their eyes darting between Walter and Pam as the weight of the recording settled over the room. Walter's face twisted in fury, his composure completely shattered. "This is slander," he shouted, his voice cracking. "You have no right, no authority, to bring this into my courtroom." Pam's eyes flashed with determination as she turned to address the gallery, the jury, and even the stunned courtroom staff. "The law doesn't bend for those who abuse their power," she declared. "Not even for a man who sits on the bench." Then, with calculated precision, she delivered the final blow. "As of this morning, an arrest warrant has been issued for Judge Edward Walter, based on the evidence presented here today. Federal agents are standing by to execute it." The room froze. For a moment, it felt as though time itself had stopped. Then, the doors to the courtroom swung open, and 2 federal agents stepped inside, their presence commanding immediate attention. The entire gallery erupted in gasps and murmurs, the chaos of the moment reaching its crescendo. Walter's face drained of color as the agents approached the bench. "This is preposterous," he bellowed, his voice cracking with desperation. "You can't do this. I am a judge." One of the agents stepped forward, producing a pair of handcuffs. "Edward Walter, you are under arrest for corruption, bribery, and obstruction of justice. You have the right to remain silent." As the agent recited the Miranda rights, Walter's protests grew more frantic, but there was no stopping the inevitable. Pam watched with an expression of quiet triumph, her focus unwavering as the man who had tried to belittle and intimidate her was led away in disgrace. The gallery was a whirlwind of activity. Reporters shouting questions, cameras flashing, and spectators exchanging stunned remarks. But Pam remained composed, her mind already focused on the next steps. Turning to the jury, she said, "Ladies and gentlemen, the evidence speaks for itself. Justice must be blind, but it cannot be corrupted. Let this serve as a reminder that no one is above the law, not even those who claim to uphold it." The courtroom remained in awe as Pam returned to her seat, her gaze fixed ahead. She knew the battle wasn't over. There were still closing arguments to be made, a verdict to secure, and justice to deliver for the Ramirez family. But for now, she allowed herself a moment to breathe, knowing she had taken a stand against corruption and prevailed. The courtroom remained a hive of stunned energy as Judge Edward Walter was escorted out in handcuffs. Reporters swarmed the gallery, their whispered speculations and hurried notes filling the air like static. Pam Bondi, however, stood firm at her place by the podium, radiating an aura of calm control. Despite the chaos, her focus never wavered. Justice for her clients, the Ramirez family, was still at the center of her fight. As the federal agents exited with Walter, Pam addressed the room. "Ladies and gentlemen, what you witnessed here today is not only a fight against fraud, but a fight to preserve the integrity of our justice system." She turned toward the jury, her voice steady. "The evidence we've presented has not only implicated the defendants in gross misconduct, but has also revealed the obstacles ordinary people face when trying to seek justice." The jury's expressions were a mix of shock and understanding. They had seen an unprecedented moment in legal history unfold before them, a judge falling from his pedestal. Pam used that moment to connect with them further, ensuring the larger case remained clear amidst the scandal. She stepped back to her table, where the Ramirez family sat. Maria Ramirez, the matriarch, clutched her hands together, tears glistening in her eyes. Her husband, Juan, rested a supportive hand on her shoulder. Their teenage daughter gave Pam a small, grateful nod, her faith in justice visibly restored. The defense counsel, previously riding on Walter's bias as their safety net, now looked visibly shaken. With Walter gone and their corrupt dealings exposed, their confidence had evaporated. They shuffled papers, murmuring among themselves, clearly unsure of how to salvage the case. Pam allowed herself a deep breath, the weight of her strategy and its execution settling over her. Months of meticulous planning had come to fruition in the most public and dramatic way possible. She had faced down a corrupt judge, exposed systemic failures, and remained unshaken in the face of ridicule and condescension. When court resumed moments later, a new judge, impartial, professional, and untainted by scandal, took Walter's place. The transition was seamless, and Pam presented her closing arguments with precision. "Members of the jury," she began, pacing slightly as she addressed them. The Ramirez family trusted the defendants with their dreams, their life savings, their hopes for a better future. That trust was betrayed in the most egregious way, leaving them with nothing but heartbreak and financial ruin. She paused, her tone softening as she turned toward the Ramirez family. "These are not just numbers on a page or abstract concepts of justice. These are real people, with real lives, who have suffered because of the greed and dishonesty of others." Pam's voice strengthened as she faced the jury again. "You have the power to hold the defendants accountable, not just for what they've done to the Ramirez family, but to ensure no one else suffers the same fate. The evidence is clear, the facts are undeniable, and justice demands action." The jury's eyes remained locked on her, their expressions resolute. Pam returned to her seat, her heart steady with the knowledge that she had done all she could. As the jury deliberated, Pam sat with the Ramirez family, offering quiet reassurance. Maria whispered, "Ms. Bondi, thank you for everything. We never thought someone would stand up for us like this." Pam placed a hand on Maria's, her voice gentle. "It's not just for you. It's for everyone who's ever been silenced, dismissed, or wronged. Justice isn't just a principle. It's a promise." When the jury returned hours later, the courtroom held its breath. The foreperson rose, her voice clear and confident as she read the verdict. "We, the jury, find the defendants guilty on all counts." The gallery erupted in gasps, cheers, and murmurs. Maria wept quietly, clutching her husband's hand as their daughter smiled for the first time in what felt like months. Pam allowed herself a small, triumphant smile, the victory a testament to the power of persistence and truth. As the courtroom emptied, reporters flocked to Pam, their questions coming rapid fire. "Ms. Bondi, how do you feel about today's events? What's next for you after exposing such high-level corruption?" Pam paused, turning to face the sea of microphones and cameras. Her answer was measured but impactful. "Today was a victory for justice, not just for my clients, but for everyone who believes in fairness and accountability. Corruption has no place in our courts, and I will continue to fight for those who can't fight for themselves." Later that evening, as Pam walked out of the courthouse, the setting sun bathed the building in golden light. She stopped on the steps, looking out over the bustling city. The fight against corruption and injustice would never truly end, but moments like this reminded her why she had chosen this path. Pam Bondi straightened her shoulders, her resolve as strong as ever. Justice had prevailed today, and she would ensure it continued to prevail tomorrow. The sun had dipped below the Orlando skyline, casting the courthouse in hues of gold and orange as Pam Bondi stood on the courthouse steps. The events of the day played through her mind like a whirlwind. Judge Edward Walter's arrest, the jury's unanimous guilty verdict, and the Ramirez family's tearful relief. Justice had prevailed, but the battle had been long and grueling. Pam glanced at Maria Ramirez, who stood nearby with her family. Maria approached Pam, her eyes still glistening with gratitude. "Ms. Bondi," Maria began softly, "I don't have the words to thank you. You didn't just fight for us. You fought for everyone who's been silenced." Pam smiled warmly, placing a reassuring hand on Maria's shoulder. "Maria, this victory belongs to you and your family too. Your courage to stand up and seek justice is what made this possible." Maria nodded, her grip on her husband's hand tightening. The couple's daughter smiled shyly at Pam, her eyes reflecting hope for the future. As the Ramirez family departed, Pam turned back to the courthouse, the imposing building now quiet and still. She took a moment to reflect, her mind wandering to the larger implications of the day's events. Judge Walter had been a symbol of corruption, a man who had wielded his power for personal gain, dismissing the very principles of fairness and justice he was sworn to uphold. His fall was a reminder that no one, not even those at the highest levels, was above accountability. Pam's thoughts shifted to the many others who had likely suffered under Walter's rulings but lacked the means to fight back. This victory, she realized, was a step toward restoring faith in the system. A system that still had flaws but could be redeemed through persistence and integrity. She glanced down at her briefcase, the weight of its contents lighter now that the fight was over. The evidence she had presented, meticulously gathered and irrefutably damning, had not just won a case. It had exposed a deeper truth about the importance of standing up against corruption. Pam took a deep breath, her resolve strengthening. Today was a victory, but the fight for justice was far from over. For every case like the Ramirez family's, there were countless others waiting for someone to speak up, to challenge the powerful and uphold the principles of fairness. As the last of the reporters packed up their cameras and the courthouse steps emptied, Pam walked toward her car. The evening air was cool and refreshing, a stark contrast to the heated emotions of the day. She climbed into the driver's seat, her mind already turning to the next challenge. In the rearview mirror, the courthouse loomed, a symbol of both justice and the struggle to achieve it. Pam smiled faintly, her determination as strong as ever. As she drove off into the night, her thoughts lingered on a simple but profound truth. Justice wasn't just an ideal. It was a fight worth every effort, every sacrifice, and every ounce of strength. This concluding section ties together Pam's triumph, her reflections on justice, and her unwavering commitment to fighting corruption. I hope you enjoyed this story. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts about it. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss new and equally exciting stories. See you in the next video.